You're listening to Mom and Doc Talk, where we talk all things healing PANS and PANDAS with an emphasis on homeopathy.
Hi, I'm Jody the mom.
And I'm Dr. Bar the Doc, and welcome to Mom and Doc Talk. We are so thrilled to have Ashley back to join us today. I can't wait to introduce her to you guys. We're having her back in a different capacity than before. She was on an episode with us previously with her daughter, talking about her own personal experience, and we've asked her to come back as a professional today to talk to us. So let me just do a quick introduction for Ashley as the professional versus Ashley the mom, although she's going to end up blending a little bit of the two today, and we're asking her to do something that's a little bit out of her comfort zone with blending the two. So we're so grateful that you're willing to join us. So Ashley Keller is first and foremost a mom in a neurodiverse home that enjoys nature, fasting, traveling, and adventure. In her personal life, she is a neuro-affirming board-certified behavioral analyst, certified regular and special education teacher with a background in psychology, and just started coursework in functional nutrition, blood chemistry, and planning to specialize in gut health. Ashley owns her own business, Empower Self-Care and Consulting, supporting neurodiverse and/or overwhelmed families by empowering them to follow their gut, advocate to be true to themselves. And Ashley has also experienced PANS and PANDAS as a mom and possibly herself, and has been treating with resilience for both herself and her daughter for many years. She does what she can to support both the PANS and neurodivergent communities by educating, advocating, and amplifying lived experiences. She's also passionate about ensuring that individuals receive appropriate, respectful, and safe care. So welcome, Ashley, in this uncomfortable but so important capacity where you are willing to blend the behavioral side of things with the neuroinflammatory side of things and the mom experience and the professional experience. And this is exactly why we wanted you to come back, is because we know that so many people get shoved down the behavioral route with these kids who have neuroinflammation, and but there's also some aspects when there is neuroinflammation that things can become behavioral too, and it can just get really, really dicey. And so we wanted to bring in somebody who has some professional expertise and some personal expertise to help us navigate these really challenging waters of, is it behavior or is it inflammation? Is it both? Where do we cross over and how do we figure this out? So welcome, and thank you for being willing to be vulnerable and navigating this with us.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me again.
So just for a brief review, in case anybody missed you guys on your episode with you and your daughter, just give us a really brief introduction for like what brought you to this field and a little bit about your history.
Okay, so brief. I'm really bad at brief, so I'm going to do my best. And I have notes. So if I'm looking off awkwardly, it's because I have notes so I don't miss things. So just FYI.
Well, we appreciate that you put enough effort into this, that you take this seriously, that you are willing to make notes for this. Like that just tells you like how committed you are to this. So thank you.
Yeah.
So yeah, tell us a little bit.
So when my kiddo was about 6, she like fell off the PANDAS cliff. Hot mess. She was kicked out of, we had like a fall off the cliff time, like I can pinpoint that, but she also was always more. And I like to say that because a lot of the diagnostic criteria says, like abrupt onset and stuff, but there's so many families out there. And I think there's even research coming out that shows like maybe even half of families, there's more of an insidious onset. She definitely was always more. She was later diagnosed as neurodivergent, and I was diagnosed as neurodivergent right around the time she fell off the cliff. So it was really interesting. So she was always more, and like I said, getting kicked out of daycares and things, and we started to piece together that it would happen like right after she was sick. She would like fight people, or if she had been on steroids, but of course that was because she was sick. All of these things. So that's kind of, we went through the conventional medicine route, and it was helpful for us. She never had to do anything like IVIG because we found homeopathy before we went that route. But she, steroids and antifungals and antibiotics and all of those things and tons of supplements kind of maintained her, but it wasn't making her better. And there were also side effects of all of those things. So anyway, like fast forward, we ended up moving towards homeopathy and have never looked back. But professionally, like I I have always been very active and always loved outdoors. I've been riding horses since I was 6 or 7. Hated school and team sports. So when I was in school, my parents were like, you need to do something. Like, you can't just go to school and come home and, whatever, hang out. So I started volunteering at a facilitative equestrian therapy barn, and I met lots of different individuals with lots of different, mobility differences, neurodivergence. That's where I met my first human with autism. And so I was super intrigued and loved working, especially with that population. I loved all of our students, but that especially, I was just so intrigued by the way they saw the world and everything. And so I started thinking like, maybe I want to do something with this. So I eventually went to school for psychology, and then added on my teaching certs, because why not? And then went on for my master's in education with a focus in applied behavior analysis, and then on for my boards for my BCBA. But in the meantime of all of those things, I always struggled with a lot of the interventions that were taught and used. And I still really struggle with it. And I almost left the behavior field because of it. And thankfully, somehow, I don't even know how it happened, I found small pockets, and they're getting bigger now, of neurodivergent affirming, or just neuro affirming, like the neurodiversity movement, and other pockets of BCBAs and other people in the field, supporting these individuals that are very neuro affirming and really working to try to change things. So that's where like a lot of my advocacy comes in, is like, we need to do better. Like, when we know better, we do better, and we know better now. And the autistic community is telling us these things.
Mhm.
So anyway, so that's how I ended up here. And I am thankful that I do have all that background, because I do think that allowed us to keep my kiddo safe when she fell off the cliff. I think we could have had a very different experience if I didn't have the background I had, and the support that I had and that my husband and I both had for each other, and from our family and friends that knew. We've always been very open about our journey and like what's going on. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
Ashley, help
I
me
really
on.
love.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Jody.
No, go ahead. Ashley, help me understand a little bit more about exactly what a behavioral analysis did, and anybody else who doesn't quite understand exactly what you do.
Yeah. So I will tell you what I do as a BCBA. So generally speaking, BCBAs are supposed to use the science of behavior to drive socially significant change. That's basically like what we're supposed to be doing. What I personally do is I work to empower neurodiverse families. So like my big thing, and that's why my company is called Empower Self-Care and Consulting, is to empower people, because people have so much more ability than the rest of the world kind of gives you credit for. There's just so many specialists and all these different people to see for all these different things, but your gut can tell you a lot. So like if you can take the time and have the confidence to learn, like, you can do a lot of things, So like, I really try to empower neurodiverse families, focus on building understanding of how everyone's brains are different, and we all process things differently, and we all have different needs. Like that, again, going back to the neurodiversity kind of movement and thought process, is like, nothing's wrong. Like, neurodivergence, it's diverging from the typical, but it's not wrong. And
Mhm.
so helping families critically evaluate recommendations and supports, challenging ableist ideas, and really, really focusing on self-advocacy. But you have to be confident and you have to be empowered in order to be even willing to try to self-advocate, right? And so much of what the world does to us is try to shut us up, basically. So I really try to like really work with families and the kiddos to talk about what they need, and think about what they need, and how you can get that point across. And it's a safety thing. Like, to me, that's a huge safety thing. So really working on that, supporting individuals to live the life they want to live, and figure out what supports they need, finding unmet needs and reducing them, or like building upon them, strengths-based type stuff. and making sure that people feel safe, because a big issue that I have with like traditional ABA is that it triggers the fight, flight, freeze. Like if somebody was just trying to make me comply, I can tell you right now that's not going to go well. It doesn't go well at all. And my kid is the same way. Most people are, you know. And so when people feel safe and they feel empowered to be who they are and to speak up if something doesn't feel right, that is when they can learn. That's when they can access that place in their brain, and they can build on their strengths and find what makes them tick. And so that's really, there's a whole lot more to it, but that's basically the basis of what I do with families. Is I really just try to empower them and help them understand and give them confidence to speak up for themselves.
So when you say safety, it sounds like you're talking about safety, like the experience of safety with the individual that you're working with, not so much like safety as perceived by others. Is that correct?
So both, I would say.
Okay.
So like when I'm talking about safety in the form of self-advocacy, I want people to be able to say no.
Mhm.
And I want people to listen to them. So like if kids are saying, no, I don't want to hug that person. Okay, you don't have to hug that person because that doesn't feel comfortable to you. And that's a safety thing, because if you're constantly telling someone that they should go against what they feel, that's
Mhm.
not safe, because you need to learn to trust yourself, and you need to learn. But obviously that individual also does need to be safe. So there obviously are situations like if we're having severe aggression or property destruction or self-injurious behaviors, we need to reduce those. But it's not just reducing those, that's giving us information that behavior is telling us that there's unmet needs or there's barriers, and that's on
Yeah.
us as adults to keep them safe by figuring out why that's happening and to fix it and
Yeah.
help them fix it.
Yeah. I'm so grateful to have you coming in and sharing this perspective because, before long time ago, I worked as an ABA therapist, like in like working with the individuals, and I had some problems with it too. And I know that like it's definitely, and this is like, I'm so old, I'm not going to say how old I am. Before we had a realization about all of the problems that really
Yeah.
are inherent in some of the ways that we address ABA therapy. And so, I mean, like the reality is like neuro whatever, like if somebody's upset about something and they're listening to something that's happening in their body and you say calm down,
Oh yeah.
is anybody going to calm down? Nobody,
No,
not a single
no.
person. So I appreciate the approach that you're bringing to us, and because you've got like the expertise in behavioral things, because like I said at the beginning, there are things that are really truly behavioral, that we can learn people, like help people learn to have more adaptive behavior, in interactions versus maladaptive behavioral interactions. Like they are all coming from the same place of an unmet need, like you said.
Mhm.
But there's things that work versus things that are not as
Right.
successful in getting that need met.
Yeah.
But of course, let's bring it back to PANS and PANDAS because we have that added challenge of
Yeah.
inflammation. So what are some signs, like when you're working with people, just pause and like go back just a second, because this all came up because we were talking about how you have seen a bunch of people that have come to
Mhm.
work with you for behavioral analysis, and you can see that like this is inflammation based, and there's only so much that we're going to be able to accomplish until this gets taken care of.
Right.
So that's what like triggered, like we have to have you on to talk about this.
Yeah.
So what are some of the signs that you've seen with people that you've worked with that it's inflammation based more than just a behavioral coping strategy or coping mechanism?
Yeah. So generally there's a few things. So I have found that these parents, when they come to me, it's immediate red flag is when they are frantic, and
Mhm.
when this is like earth shattering type stuff, and when they tell me like they've tried everything. That so when I
Mhm.
hear those things, I'm like, okay, let's talk some more, and like tell me your story, like tell me what has happened. So parents that are describing like super up and down, so like lots of progress, lots of regression, lots of like that, like that's something else is probably happening there, right? And especially if we look at this pattern, and and can't find triggers. So like, okay, maybe we see massive regression if we've had a staff change, or massive regression if we've started a new school, or, changed homes, or there's a divorce. Like there's clear triggers that could trigger these things. Okay. But like when we're talking about just kind of randomly getting better and worse, like what's happening there? That to me says there's an underlying medical issue probably happening here that's going on. The other thing is if kiddos have a ton of diagnoses. So if someone comes to me and goes, my kid has autism, ADHD, OCD, ODD, anxiety, panic disorder, toileting issues, rage, and atypical response to meds, I'm like, well, that's because they don't have all of those things. They have one thing that's causing them all,
Yeah.
And so when I hear that, I'm like, stop. Let's have a chat here, And so I will start asking more questions, like, when did this start? Like, or the other thing is, and this is happening more and more, so this one's not as clear anymore. Really late diagnosis for things. So like if I have a mom that calls me and their 16-year-old who was totally typically developing until 9th grade, and now all of a sudden they can't dress themselves, they're refusing food, they're having rage episodes. Like, I'm like, okay, so let's back up to 9th grade. Like, did you go to the doctor at any point? And like, we start literally going through, like, was there like a clear infection, like infectious trigger, or was there like a traumatic experience? Were you living in mold? Like, so like and usually the answer is yes. Like we end up going, oh yeah, he had a really bad case of mono, like at the summer before 9th grade, like, or whatever. And so those are probably the biggest red flags to me. If I'm having people tell me nothing else has worked, or they have a million different diagnoses, or this came out of nowhere. Or I do also have families where I think it's probably like congenital Lyme. Now, I can't diagnose, I am not a medical professional, but like parents who tell me like, my kiddo has always had feeding issues and sleep issues and toileting issues and obvious GI distress and like all of these things. And then it just kept getting progressively worse. That's also something that I would be like, that tells me there's underlying medical stuff going on that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. I love that you bring up the multiple diagnoses, because I see that too from a different perspective, from like a doctor perspective. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that are like, yeah, my kid just has like the same things you just listed off. And I'm like, yeah, your kid probably doesn't have those things. Your kid probably has PANS.
Right.
So many times. Yeah.
Right. Now, I will say though, you can have like autism or ADHD and PANS or PANDAS. Like you can have, or any of the things, like you can. It's not that you can't have both. But when they just keep like stacking on, right, it's because the presentation probably continued to change, probably from either different triggers or progression of what, like
right. And that's where we have to figure out. And like, that's sort of what we're talking about here too. And I think that, we'll talk about it next, is when there's overlap between inflammation and behavioral components. And so like, because you absolutely can see people who are neurodivergent, and might have, behavioral maladaptations or whatever, how are the appropriate way to say, like, behaviors, that also have inflammation contributing to it. And so the inflammation just makes things substantially worse, a lot more chaotic, a lot more changeable. And there's only so much that you can do, because you can't out therapy inflammation.
No.
So
no.
Yeah. So when you do have this overlap between behavioral and inflammation components, what do you do as a behavior?
So for me, as a private business owner, I generally work with the family at that point to figure out treatment options and like building supports that we can get that in place. And I go back to safety, because at least for my kiddo, and I assume for a lot of people, kind of backing up, one of the great things about our situation was that I did have this background, but also we had the ability as a family to remove her from school. And for us, that was huge, because taking her away from all of those triggers, like the germ triggers, and I'm pretty sure there's the one school that she was in had mold. Also all the just chaos of school, like school's chaotic. And at that point she was like kindergarten, first grade. So like mass chaos. And so removing those for her was huge. So we really were able to kind of drill down and see like what was actually going on and like what triggers really were, because we had such control of the environment, like we weren't sending her, like we knew what she was eating. We knew what germs she had been exposed to. We knew what, like her sleeping and like whatever, her fluid intake, like all of these things. So we kind of could control all of these other variables. So we were able to really see like what the triggers were. And one of the things that happened with her, and I maybe have this in my notes later, but we were playing a game one day with my grandmother, and she got so excited that she picked up a bottle and like wailed it across the room. And thankfully, like she wasn't mad. She was so excited, but it had triggered her that fight, flight, freeze. And even though she wasn't fighting in an angry way, like that's what happened. And then immediately went into a panic attack. And so that was from excitement, and so that right there, we all like stopped and we were like, what just happened? But it really was a good example of like how kind of keeping a calm, if you can, keeping calm and really focusing on like safety and respect and maintaining dignity, because anything that can trigger the fight, flight, or freeze, again, at least with my kiddo, even excitement that could trigger rage or panic attacks. And so if I'm working with kiddos, or I'm working with families to support their kiddos while we're working through all of this, safety is what I'm focusing on, like a feeling of safety and kind of consistency so that we can reduce those triggers, right? And then the other thing is like, if there's an overlap, and we'll talk, I think we're going to talk about this a little more later, but like once the healing process has started and like gotten much better, and you can take a step back, sometimes it is easier to see. It's hard at first, but sometimes you can start figuring out. But again, even if the child is choosing that behavior, it's still a safety response from their brain. So Dr. Mona Delahook talks about this a lot. She's awesome. I love her. If you don't follow her, you should. She really works from like the polyvagal theory of things and the safety and like top down, bottom up behaviors, and how we have to figure out like why someone's responding the way they're responding, and so their brain, something in their brain is telling them to respond that way. So even if it's a choice, why is that the choice? And so that's our job as the adults to figure out, why is this response happening, and support them through it. I don't know
Boy,
if I
I wish
answered the question.
yeah, I'm just sitting here thinking as you're talking, I wish all of this stuff is not stuff that I knew that I needed to look into, but I could imagine how beneficial even, listening to you talk about it, or even doing any research on this stuff. I know PANS wasn't easy for you, but with your background and your education, um, some things must have made more sense to you as you moved through it, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And even more so now, like I was not always neurodivergent affirming in my care, which I hate, but like it is what, I mean, you do what you know, and then you do
Yeah.
better when you know better, right? And so we have to keep moving forward and asking questions and doing better. And so I didn't necessarily I always questioned stuff. There's probably things like if I went back, I would do some things differently.
Mhm.
Um, but I do definitely think that it was helpful having the background that I have, for sure, and questioning things that I had questioned, because it was recommended to us, like, go see a psychiatrist and get in behavior therapy. And we did try
Yeah.
like cognitive behavior therapy, actually. And it was really funny because my child, and you both know her, she has her opinions and she shares them. And we went to him and she's like, I really like the guy, but he just doesn't get it. She was like, he thinks I'm like doing this on purpose, but it's not on purpose. Like my brain's telling me. So her issue at that point was frequent urination. It was like constant. And it happened when she was flaring. And so it did not happen when she wasn't flaring.
Mhm.
And he was trying to teach her like ways of coping with it. And she's like, number one, mom, it doesn't happen when my brain's fine. And she's like, and also like, I don't think he understands why I do it. She's like, I'm not choosing to do it. Like even she was like, this doesn't even make sense.
Yeah.
It was pretty funny. And I think she was like 7 or 8 at the time. Like she was young and she was like, this is not going to work, mom. She's like, I like the guy, but he's got nothing.
Yeah. Even she got it at that age.
It was really funny. Yeah.
What about, have you worked with people who have inflammatory basis for behaviors that still need support for learned aspects that can come along with that continued reinforcement?
Yeah. So number one is I think so like the continued reinforcement of these like dangerous behaviors or bad behaviors or whatever, maladaptive behaviors, whatever you want to call them. In the PANS world, as a PANS parent, sometimes we are reinforcing things that we had no idea when we went into this whole parenting gig that we ever would. And so we kind of just have to let that go because you're in survival mode.
Mhm.
So I think that's number one.
Yep.
Is you have to give yourself and your child and your partner grace for allowing things and for maybe living in a way or even doing things yourself that you never imagined that you would do or allow. So let that go. But
Mhm.
also, like when there is a behavioral piece to it, they have to be healing. So if the inflammatory process is pretty well controlled and it's pretty clear when they're flaring and when they're well, that is when we can kind of start to have these conversations and rational conversations with the kiddo or the individual. Maybe they're not a kiddo. And but the thing is like I just said about the CBT, like in my experience, and I have heard other families say otherwise. So like again, this is all super individualized. Probably no harm in trying it, but be very aware that it might not be helpful. Because if we had kept going with the CBT and my kid hadn't voiced that, and I think a lot of kids don't, like mine does, thankfully, but a lot of kids don't. And so they're internalizing that and they're thinking like, I'm failing, I'm not doing this, I'm not trying hard enough, I'm not whatever. And they're like internalizing that and thinking that they suck basically. And that's not the message obviously we want to give our kids, right? And
Yeah.
so I think knowing when, like if you can clearly see like, okay, right now they're great, so like let's try to do some things, let's try to learn some things, but when they're flaring, it's probably not going to be super effective anyway. So like if we're talking when they're well and when they're not flaring, making sure that those things aren't lingering during those times, which for us, luckily, they didn't really. If she was well, she was well,
Yeah.
and stuff didn't linger. But also like setting boundaries on that. But a neuroimmune response, like if you're having inflammatory things going on in your brain and you're trying to like behavior or therapy things out, that's like trying to control a seizure with behavioral interventions or whatever, like therapy of some kind. Like can you avoid triggers? Yeah, you can. Is that going to be 100% effective? No, not necessarily. And so that's what I explain to parents is I'm like, look, this is not, these aren't choices, and this is a medical thing that's happening, and you can try all the things that you want to try, but if they're not well and their brain is inflamed, there's no stopping it. It is what it is, And so you have to understand that they can't. It's not that they won't. And actually, Dr. Ross Green, I think it is, talks about that a lot. And there's like a really cool visual that I share all the time in my group. But it really is like looking at things as they cannot do this right now.
Yeah.
It's not that they won't. But why can't they? Is it because of a medical issue? Is it because of an unmet need? Is it because of whatever? Like, who knows? Or
Yeah.
maybe they haven't had enough sleep or they've eaten the wrong food or like so many things,
Yeah.
but you have to make sure they're well because we don't want them to internalize that it's their fault.
Yeah.
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 So I'm curious when we're talking about this, like this need to identify when we see persistent behaviors between flares or as they're healing. Um, being that like the important sweet spot, right?
Mhm.
So I'm curious, as a person who has experience with somebody healing with homeopathy and having done some healing yourself, if you have advice for parents that are using homeopathy for their healing journey to recognize when they're having that shift from inflammation mediated behaviors to more learned behaviors or adaptive coping strategies. Any
Yeah.
advice?
So my number one advice, like piece of advice, would be to get help for your trauma. Because um, caring for someone with an inflammatory brain disorder can, and it often does, right? Absolutely rip you to shreds. Like I just said, like you're allowing things that you never thought you would allow. People are judging you. People are gaslighting you. The medical communities, you're fighting for everything. It can be super hard on relationships of all kinds, not just marriages. You know, like it's really bad. Like you're afraid, you're constantly researching, you probably are sleep deprived, you're probably not taking very good care of yourself. You might be a punching bag verbally and physically. It's all consuming, right? So like when you are looking at the world through a trauma lens, you're going to miss things.
Mhm.
Like you just are. You're so dragged under by this that you can't hear your gut. You're not going to listen to it. And I am a huge proponent, and I know Jody and Dr. Barr are too, is you got to listen to your mama gut. And I know dads probably have it too, but I call it mama gut because I'm mama. So you need to be able to hear that, and you need to be confident in yourself and empowered to listen to it. So you need to make sure that you are okay before you try to decipher your kiddo's behavior, right?
Well, I have to
So
chime in here to say too that like you be able to hear it and know that that's truly what it is and not
yes,
anxiety, right?
yes,
And
yes,
to be able to to decipher, is this mama gut or is this fear?
yes.
Because there's so and also to like to get to the place where you're not um seeing things for your kids differently than they are. So it's not just like missing things, but it can also be misinterpreting
Oh
things
yeah.
too.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's all from trauma, right?
Mhm.
And so this is traumatic, and you need to deal with that for yourself also. So once you've dealt with that, and or you're dealing with that, because it can be an ongoing thing, it probably will be, um, is once your kiddo is less inflamed, you can start talking about increasing expectations and seeing how it goes when you start to set and hold boundaries, and will they still, like, what support and guidance are they still going to need? They're going to need something. That's parenting, right? Like we're still raising kids here. And so figuring out like what support, what guidance do they need, what boundaries work for them, how much freedom can they handle, or how much freedom do they need, and that is going to be all based on your kiddos and following their lead, like meeting. This is another thing I talk about all the time, is we need to meet people where they are. So like I'm meeting parents where they are, I'm meeting their kids where they are, I'm trying to teach parents to meet their kids where they are, because if you're way up here and they're down here, that's not going to work. So that's really important, is that you figured your stuff out from the chaos and insanity that you've been surviving in, but also that you're working with your kids. And if you know my kiddo and I, or you've heard us talk before, like we communicate a lot. And it's not like, let's talk about feelings, like it's not like that. It's like we might be screaming at each other like that, like, and I'm like, okay, stop. Like, why are we even yelling? I don't like, what happened? Because something got missed. Like, what's going on? So being open to having conversations with your kids and listening to them, not just to respond, but actually listening to what they're telling you, and maybe even what they're not telling you, like read between the lines, um, and being willing to work with them, like really collaborate with them to figure out what everybody needs.
Mhm.
I just have to reaffirm everything that you said about mama doing her own healing and dad too. I
Yep.
did not start my own healing journey until well after Avery was healed. And it was really me that was keeping us in that space. Like I wasn't able to recognize what was behaviorally appropriate and what wasn't, because my body was still having that stronger response to everything, even when it wasn't a big thing.
Yep.
So yeah, amen to all of that. What about, have you seen your own parenting strategies and behaviors shift as you're seeing less inflammation with your daughter?
Yeah, so I can talk a big game as a professional, but as a mom, like I said, there's a lot that I would do differently, and probably like sometimes I lay in bed at night, I'm like, man, I really messed that up. Like I could have done that better. And I don't beat myself up over it because like I said, like you move on, you learn from it and move on. We try to do better next time. Like we're not perfect. But yes, so like I always struggled a lot with letting go, which is why I like try to bring it up so much because it is so hard because I'm like, she's better than that. Like she can do that. Or like she know, like I taught her better, and but she can't, like, and she couldn't at that point. And
Yeah.
so that was really hard. Um, what what I think we kind of shifted from, so like she really was, I mean, she was trying to jump out of cars, she was threatening to stab us with knives, like at one point. Like there was some really bad, very dark, scary times that we had. And at that time, like I always try to say, like, what's our end goal here? Like what right now is our the most important thing, and it's safety. So
Mhm.
that's what we focused on. And pretty much everything else got let go. Like if she was safe, then we were fine at that point. I was like, whatever, like just as long as she is safe. And so we then started to heal and get out of that. And so we were able to meeting her where we need. So whatever supports she needed at that time is what we did. So like when we got out of the rages, unfortunately, we kind of sunk back into the panic attacks and the hyperactivity. Like, holy crap, this child, she is hyperactive on top of the pan symptoms, but literally, like, she would do school sometimes upside down on the couch, like on her head. Like, and we always, like, she still does. She has an exercise ball in her room, she has a swing in her room, she has a beanbag in her room, we have body socks, we have weighted blankets, like we have all of those things. And we built our lives around the fact that none of us can sit still. This is the longest I've sat still all day. Like I don't sit ever. And I'm moving like all over the place. So, like we mountain bike and we horseback ride and we hike through the woods and we're running around out back with the chickens and the dogs and the ducks and whatever. Like we're so active. So we meet her where she is, and it's just good for the whole family. And the other piece is she's our only child. So that also is a really big piece for us. And that is obviously a whole other bag of worms, like when you have other kids. And especially if you have other kids that also have neurodivergence or, neuroimmune disorders or whatever, like that's a lot. So, meeting the brain and body needs helps the nervous system feel safe and allows for that learning and some self-control, maybe. But also a reminder, self-control is not really considered to be even close to fully developed until like the 20s, like 20 plus
I
years
don't
old.
have it now. So I think it's got to be somewhere in your 60s
Right?
because I
Yes.
don't have it. At least I'm hoping. I'm hoping that maybe in my 60s I'll have some more self-control than I have right now.
Yeah, yeah. So we did all of those things and tried to meet her where she was, and really worked with her on like brainstorming and troubleshooting and trying to help her figure out like different scenarios, different supports and things like that to basically give her power back to her own body, because the way she always described it was that her brain was like a computer that she couldn't control. So for years this kid was living in a body with a brain that she felt that she was not in control of. So trying to give that power back to her and empower her to use it, right? So being unwell makes you feel powerless, so empowering them is a big deal.
So I'm hearing a lot with like you keep saying safety, 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 safety keeps coming up. And when you know better, you do better. And a lot of these different things, and empowerment, your business and like just now talking about empowering To me, that really calls to mind boundaries, lots of different ways of like looking at boundaries. And so
Yep.
I'm curious if you can talk to us a little bit more about what boundaries would look like for a PANS family, not just for parents, but for helping the kids themselves to also hold their own boundaries. And that navigating that relationship between like their boundaries and your boundaries, and when there might be conflict, and when sometimes you might need to like let things go.
Right.
So yeah, just let's talk a little bit about boundaries
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
PANS families.
So this one's tough because
Yeah.
just like everything else, it really depends. It depends on the family, right? So, like I said in one of the previous answers, for us, the biggest boundary was always safety. So, and then we kind of built from there. And I feel like that's a really, like, that's a relevant
Yeah.
boundary, right? Like, and I feel like that's a really, I mean, it's a hugely important one. If we're not safe, like nothing else matters. So we need to be physically safe. And I think that that is, I think that's a good boundary to start with for all families is safety, like truly. And if I had to pick one, that would be it. So like this is the boundary that you start with is safety, and you can build from there based on how they are. You know, so
Yeah.
like if they if they are not flaring, then we might have different boundaries and we might have higher expectations. But again, like it also depends, like how long aren't we flaring and how long were we flaring? And
Mhm.
because I mean, think about if you were sick for 2 weeks and then the next day you weren't sick and people like immediately wanted perfection, like that's not going to go well.
Yeah.
So you have to think about, you know, like kind of putting it all in perspective is like what's what really is like realistic, I guess is a good
Mhm.
word. Like try to be realistic about your expectations. And in the grand scheme of things, what really matters. So like we ended up homeschooling eventually because I felt like a whole lot of that other stuff didn't matter. And
Yeah.
it was just a huge stressor that we didn't need.
Yeah.
So I think safety is a good boundary starting point, and then
Mhm.
just building from there. But also like going back to the getting therapy for yourself or therapy or whatever supports it is that you need so that you feel comfortable when that's the only boundary, because that's a really tough pill to swallow. It's very hard for
Yeah.
me, was very difficult. Um, because we expect so much from our kids and we see our kids as a reflection of ourselves and what we've taught them, right? And what they may or may not be capable of at that point when they're well or not. Like we have to believe when they're not well that they really can't, and sometimes even when they are well they can't because there's something that's in the way or an unmet need. So I really think that like understanding where you're coming from with your own feelings and why you're feeling that way and how you're projecting that onto your kiddos is really important.
Mhm.
But also I think safety, like you should always start with safety. If you're safe, sometimes that's good enough, right? Like we're all surviving, so let's just go from there.
Yeah. I have a couple of thoughts with what you just shared. So the first thought is that safety, there could potentially be a conflict. I just want to acknowledge that for people that like what feels safe for you as an
Yes.
adult without an inflamed brain might
Yeah.
be in direct conflict to what feels safe to the child who has an inflamed brain. And so they might not feel like it's safe to come into their home because their home is contaminated, but you feel like it's not safe for them to just live outside, and
Right.
so there might be some conflicts with boundaries and like the idea of what safety is when somebody is in an inflamed state. And so just having that, even something as simple and as like fantastic as like your baseline can have some challenges with it.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing you don't have any advice on what to do with that other than like obviously you as the adult need to do the thing, and it might just mean that you have a hard day because your boundary of safety is in conflict with your child's boundary of safety, and that might be in a place where you need to get urgent help, whether it be with a homeopath, an emergency room doctor, your pediatrician, your pan specialist, whomever it happens to get to that place that you can have the same idea of what safety is.
Yeah.
Um,
And I
so
think so, and I think you had other thoughts, but to that
Mhm.
point, um, my kiddo at one point was having really bad panic attacks, and it wasn't necessarily like because home was safe or unsafe or contaminated or anything like that, or she never voiced that anyway, but she couldn't be inside.
Mhm.
And so she would run out the door. And so
Mhm.
sometimes she would do that at 2 a.m. because we're having a panic attack and she's running out the door in her bare feet into the middle of the night. Thankfully, at that point, she was also afraid of the dark, so I could get her back in by turning the light off because she would be freaking terrified because it was dark outside. Like there's no light, like we don't have street lights where we live, and so that would get her back in. But what we did was we worked together, and this is not always possible because sometimes we have no rational thoughts when our brain is inflamed. But with her, we were able to say, like, look, we can put on coats, we can put on boots, and I will go outside and I will sit with you, but we're only going to stay out for this amount of time. We're going to set a timer, and then we have to come back in because it is too cold and it is the middle of the night, and
Mhm.
so we would go out and give her that ability. But I was also setting that boundary of like, we will come in when this timer goes
Yeah.
off. And I literally set a timer, and I would set it on, like, we have a little like swinging thing out front, and I would sit it there so she could see. And we would do like 10 minutes or whatever. And I would tell her, like, at 5 minutes, all right, we got 5 more minutes. And at 1 minute left, I would say, we only have 1 more minute. Like, what do you want to do with that minute or whatever? For her, that worked. Like you said, that's not always going to work for everyone. And it certainly, setting boundaries can escalate because you're
Yeah.
telling them no.
Well, and the reality that my other thought is like perfect segue into this is that this does not come from me. This comes from Dr. Becky Kennedy. So if you don't follow her for like parenting and just like human advice, then you should. But so she talks about how a boundary is not what you expect others to do. It is what you will do. And
Correct.
I think that that's an important thing to remember too when we're talking about boundaries, especially when we're talking about boundaries around safety. It's not,
Yes.
I expect you to come inside, as if you do not come inside, I will carry you
Right.
inside
When this
to
timer
make sure
goes
you're
off,
safe.
I'm going to make sure that we go inside. And I told
Right.
my kiddo that all the time, is like, as your mom and as the person that is responsible for you, I have to make this choice, even though you don't feel like it's good for you. This is what we have to do because we do. But the thing is with those boundaries is we have to be careful that we're not setting those hard boundaries willy-nilly. Like, that really should be, and this is where I keep coming back to safety, for safety purposes. Like, not just because like you have to eat your peas. You don't freaking have to eat your peas. Like, no, I'm sorry, but the world's not going to end if you don't eat peas. Like, that is
Mhm.
not a battle worth fighting. And
Right.
so picking and choosing and making sure that you really are choosing the ones that are necessary, because kids' lives are so dictated by other people as it is, that how frustrating if, like, are we really fighting about this? Like, we don't need to do that. So
And
yes,
it's again, it's
exactly.
about something you can do, because like you can't make your child eat. You cannot make your child go to
Right.
sleep. You can't make your child go to the
Yep.
bathroom, whatever it happens to be that you're fighting over. So it's about what you will do
Yes.
when X, Y, or Z happens, or when
Yep.
X, Y, or Z boundary is
Yeah.
crossed. So
Yeah.
yeah.
That's a good point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Ashley, I recently joined your Empowered Parents Facebook group and watched a couple of the videos, which were really good. You gave a bridge metaphor, and that just hit my mama heart, I think, for multiple different reasons. So I want you to tell us about the bridge metaphor, and I think it's just a good thing for PANS parents to hear, so we understand what our kids need us to be, but also when you have a particular parent that the kid is coming to, it was like, oh, okay, that's why Avery kept coming to me over and over again. So tell us a little bit about the bridge metaphor that you gave.
Yeah, so the bridge, I meant to go back and watch that video. I make all these videos, and then people like ask questions. I'm like, shoot, I should have watched that. I mean, I remember obviously, but like, basically it is setting clear boundaries and clear expectations. And the bridge metaphor is nice. Like, I talk about, would you rather go over the bridge that looks rickety and doesn't have edges, and it looks like, pieces are falling through and it doesn't look very stable? Or would you choose, like, how would you go over? How would you approach that bridge, and how would you cross
Mhm.
it? Or would you?
Yeah.
And then if you came up to a bridge that was solid and it barely looked different than the road that you were already on, and it had really good sides, and, like, don't you feel better crossing that bridge? You might not even think about crossing that bridge because it doesn't make you think twice, right? Like you just go because it's part of the route that you're on. And so we as parents should strive to be that, like solid bridge, basically. Like don't make them think twice about coming to you and wondering how you're going to respond. Like if you can be consistent and you can be calm, that really helps, because then they can come to you, or you can help them calm the chaos. Like when that chaos is going and they come to that bridge, like they know that it's going to be steady and sturdy and it's going to hold them, like
Yeah.
it is going to hold the chaos. And that really is, it's clear boundaries, clear expectations. And again, the boundaries, just like you said, is about how I'm going to respond, what I'm going to do with that, not what you are. I have no control, truly. Like I tell parents this all the time too. I'm like, I know you think you can control your kid, but you really can't, because if they decide they don't want to do that, they're not going to do it. And
Yeah.
you can do whatever you want, but it's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And so understanding that the only thing that you can truly control is yourself and your response to situations. And if you can make it that sturdy, solid bridge, it's helpful
Yeah.
for
And
everyone.
that's one place where it comes in useful to really pick and choose the boundaries that you set, especially if
Yeah.
you're in a really difficult home, because having boundary that you can be consistent with
Yeah.
helps make you more of a sturdy, safe bridge. Even if it's like, not, even if you want to set more boundaries or rules or higher expectations, like having the baseline
Yeah.
and being able to be consistent, because you're like, I'm not going to go on down that battle today, because
Right.
this is the one that we're sticking with. That's the most
Yeah.
important. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it would have helped me a whole lot to hear that in the midst of PANS. I think it would have, and I hear this from other moms too. There's just a certain level of frustration of like, why is it always me? Why is it in my direction? Why is this? And hearing you say that, I was like, oh, it makes a little bit more sense, because I was the one, giving the loving boundaries and providing support, and like I was the safe space. And I know people
Yep.
always say that to us, like your kid does this because you're the safe space. And I'm like, well, there's multiple safe places, but ultimately, I don't know. It almost makes me think to myself, which is weird because I don't say stuff like this to myself very often. It makes me think, oh my gosh, like that, all of that coming in my direction is how I know that I was probably doing a good job
Yeah.
uh, giving her safety.
Yeah.
And so,
And it doesn't feel good because you're a punching bag.
yeah.
Yeah, and because you are taking on all of that, which again is why it's important to get help for yourself
So, yeah.
and build your community and make sure that you have access to respite and support and all of those things, because you are taking on all of that chaos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the reality is, this just came to mind, so somebody must need to hear it, that you can have both parents being consistent, and it's
Yeah.
just they're being consistent in different ways, or ways that feel safer to somebody. So you can have a parent that is consistent, but the way they approach it works better with the child, and another parent who is consistent, but
Yeah.
they know, well, because they're consistent, if I go to them, this is the reaction I'm going to get, and I don't want that reaction, so I'm going to go over this way
Yeah.
for this reaction too.
Yeah.
Good point.
Yeah. All right. So to wrap up, one of the things that, is of course like a really big question that we always one of our topics that we always have to talk about in parenting overall is about co-regulation, and then helping through co-regulation, teaching our children how to self-regulate. So can you talk a little bit about what that might look like in PANS families?
So again, I hate to say it again, but it's going to look different, right? For every
Yeah.
family, for every kid, it looks different. And for every situation, maybe, like something that we talk about a lot in the neurodivergent community is that support needs change depending on the environment, depending on, your level of whatever stress at that point. Like I might need more support because I have a whole bunch of other things also happening. So I need more that day, even in the same environment. And so knowing what those support needs are is really big. I think at different points in our PANS journey, it has looked very different. So like sometimes with my kiddo, it looked like me literally laying in bed with her, making really dumb comments that made her giggle and take her mind off of whatever she was spiraling out of control with. Sometimes, again, it looked like sitting outside bundled up at 2 a.m. with a freaking timer sitting on the swing, like because my kid couldn't be inside at that point. Like that is co-regulating. Those are co-regulating. And a
Mhm.
lot of times kids can't regulate, right? Like they can't, like we said, like the self-control and all of those things aren't really even considered to be even close to fully developed until your 20s. And so when you're talking about a kiddo who's got an inflamed brain and possibly underlying issues, other issues, they need help. So they need you to be the sturdy bridge, right? To be that calm in their chaos and figure out what it works for them. And that's just going to be trial and error. So, sometimes we were doing tapping, sometimes we were picking out essential oils, sometimes we were sitting outside in the freezing cold. Sometimes she'll come back to me and say, I just really need to go for a walk, and so by helping her co-regulate, or you helping your kiddos co-regulate, we're teaching them what works, right? And we're troubleshooting with them, and we're showing them that like they do have the power to do this. And so helping them figure that out and empowering them to try different things and do them with them, that's helpful. And you're also then creating like probably neural pathways that show like this activity gives me relief almost,
Mhm.
like so this helps. And so it helps to do that. Sometimes it is literally putting ear things in to block out the constant noise and continuous motion and just letting them go. Because if that's how she's self-regulating, she's bouncing on a ball, singing at the top of her lungs, which my husband cannot stand. It drives him absolutely nuts. We got earbuds, to put it, not ear plugs, but ones that like redirect the calm, the flare audio ones, or
Mhm.
the loop are there two that I always recommend. So regulating yourself so that they can self-regulate without you losing your mind completely is helpful. And then, sometimes just back to the boundaries is acknowledging and validating. I talk about this a lot in my group and with my parents that I work with, is we can acknowledge and validate and still follow through. I know that
Mhm.
you're really sad and upset that we have to go inside because you don't want to be inside right now, but I told you when the timer goes off, we're going to go inside. And so we can pick something else to do inside since it's not freezing cold in the house. I've acknowledged,
Mhm.
I validated, I followed through on my boundary. And then we
Mhm.
go find something else. Maybe we're bouncing on the ball in the house. Maybe we're tapping. Maybe we're watching a movie, like whatever it is. But acknowledging and validating that the situation sucks, that's fine to do. You can do that. Be open with your kids. I think a lot of people try to like work through all of this in their heads without talking to their kids about it, when I think you actually would do a lot better to bring them into the conversation and talk about it. Um,
Mhm.
and again, like I even have a note about if things continue, what I would need to do in order to maintain safety. So like setting those boundaries, explaining why, explaining what's going to happen, those clear expectations, being that sturdy bridge. Um, and then, just knowing that if kids aren't doing it, it's not because they won't, it's because they can't.
Right. Right.
I feel like
Ash-
so much of this goes back to us as parents, which is where working with a coach comes in so handy, and being able to set the example of behavior, set the example of, helping them figure this out. And like so much of everything goes back to how we're regulated and how we're
Yeah.
responding and all of those things. So again, I have to like rewind back to our own healing and our own, whether it be therapy, whether it be homeopathy, whatever that looks like,
Mhm.
helping get our own selves through this is
Yep.
so important.
Yeah, you hit the nail on that head, because so like sometimes people come to me and want me to like fix their kids. Literally, like, can you fix my kid? And I'm like, I hate to break it to you, but it's probably you.
Yeah.
Like it's something that you're gonna have to work on, like this. I can't come if I come in and do this, they're probably gonna do it because they have no learning history with me, and so it's your relationship and your rapport and the way the whole family is functioning that needs to change,
Mhm.
you know, or even just a mindset shift. Like sometimes it literally is just looking at it from a different perspective.
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, everything you shared with us today has been so beneficial. I think this applies not only to PANDAS kids, but kids, who are neurodivergent kids and just kids in general. I mean, we've talked about
Yeah.
so many things that I'm like, okay, well, this relates to me as a parent of an almost 4-year-old. I'm curious, I'm sure people heard you as you were talking early on about being a more affirming behavior analyst. Is there a way that if people are like, okay, she's saying some things that I think maybe I could use some support in figuring out and navigating these things? So first, I guess I should say, first and foremost, when should somebody work with somebody like you if they are in that place where they've got PANDAS, but they're seeing lingering behavior between flares or some of the signs that you gave us earlier to suggest that inflammation is no longer part of it? When do you think they really should reach out to somebody like you?
I mean, in my opinion, I feel like it's always helpful, because
Always.
you're getting a different perspective and you're getting support from somebody who gets it. And that's
Mhm.
huge. That's huge for you as the parent. And there's always like little things that you can come up with that you probably like it would benefit me. Like it would have benefited me to talk to someone who was neuro-affirming and got the whole PANDAS thing, because I could have bounced things off of them like, oh my gosh, this happened and this is what I did and I really shouldn't have done that, but I'm really not sure like how I could have done it differently. You literally can just process through it and be like, you know what, maybe next time this happens, or maybe we can prevent it from happening altogether by doing X, Y, and Z. So
Mhm.
I personally think that it's always helpful because it is validating to be able to talk to somebody who gets it. And it's nice to have someone that has maybe even a slightly different perspective or just a different background. Like maybe we agree on all of the things, but I've had a different lived experience than the person that I'm talking to. Every human does. So everyone always has something to bring, in my
Mhm.
opinion, because just because of their lived experience.
So if somebody was to decide to want to work with you or another behavior analyst, I'm guessing there's not like an association for neuro-affirming behavior analysts. I'm curious if there's anything that you can suggest to people to help make sure that they are working with somebody who is neuro-affirming, if that's an
So,
important component.
oh my gosh, yes. So this is like the bane of my existence currently. So I was starting a directory of neuro-affirming providers on my website. I ended up taking it down because I can't police it. And so it's a huge liability because I don't have the capacity as myself to make sure that they are neuro-affirming and that they're using appropriate and safe practices. And so I was talking to other people in the neurodivergent community and the behavior analytic community. And so I kind of put that on pause. And so I talk a lot about it in my group. And I have helped families find like in-person providers so they could reach out to me for that. But the other thing is actually soon, like I think in January, I'm going to be talking with a organization that does credentialing currently, and they do extensive research for the credentialing. And so I approached them not too long ago and asked if they would be interested in doing a credential for like a scent-based or neurodivergent affirming, like a credential for that, because they literally are set up to do this. So I'm
Yeah.
hoping, fingers crossed, that I can work with this organization to try to get that going, because it is something that's needed. Like families want
Yeah.
and need these services, but they also want to make sure that they're getting it in a neurodivergent affirming way. Like just we want
Yeah.
to be affirming and safe. And so I'm
And
hoping
reducing
that that's
harm.
coming. Oh
'Cause,
gosh, yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, yeah, literally. Like there's hashtags like hashtag do no harm and like make shift happen. Like our big ones. Do better is another one. And so there's lots of there are companies out there that provide these services. Um, so, and I do have like on my website, am I allowed to say my website?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's empowerselfcareandconsulting.org. And on there, I do have like a scent based ABA like post. And there, I'm working on like organizing, not super great at that. But there's a post on there and there's a whole bunch of links about like what is Ascent and how to look for providers that provide it. There's things from autistic, members of the autistic community that have talked about like how to look for neuro-affirming ABA, and like I tried to pull like a bunch of things and put it out there. Again, it's empowering yourself with knowledge and learning what to look for, because I've even called providers for families and it's hard for me to figure out, like, are they or are they just blowing smoke? Because like they answer the questions, but are they doing it? And that's where, it's hard right now. So there's not a great answer. Sorry. I'm working on
But
it.
it sounds like you've got some resources and like some, I hope by the time that this episode airs that you're in the process already of getting things done, and getting an actual credential so people can have something that they can rely on.
Yeah.
And then of course, connecting with the community. So you already shared with us our website. We'll make sure we put the link for your website in the show notes so that people can link to that if they want to. And then we mentioned your Facebook group. So can you share the name of your Facebook group and any other way people could get in touch with you so they can learn more?
So I think if you go, so there's a lot of Facebook groups on Facebook. So if you shocking, what were you gonna say?
Well, I was gonna say, if you just tell us the name of it, we can also make sure we link to the exact right one too, in case
So
it's like,
I'll give you the link to it, because if you Google or if you search what I tell you, it usually brings up another group. It's a way bigger group and it has nothing to do with anything that I'm doing.
Okay.
And so but you can get to my group by going to my website. So the best way to find all of the things really is my website. So just empowerselfcareandconsulting.org. And then there you can get to my website, or obviously my website. And then you can get to my Facebook. You can get to like my blog that has a lot of the videos. Not all of the videos that are in my group are on my website, but a lot of them are. And then any resources I have, there's a free resource like button that you can click. There's just all sorts of stuff on there. So that's where I would recommend, is going to my website, and from there you can get everywhere.
Okay. Well, we're going to help give people a little bit of a cheat just in case they want to go right to your Facebook group. We'll get it.
Thanks.
We'll make sure we're linked to the right group in our show notes so you can look there if you want to connect with Ashley in that way. Thank you again for the time that you have given us today, and the expertise and that willingness to walk that line between personal and professional experience for something that is a really, really hard thing to navigate. And I think if nothing else comes from this, which you've given so many great bits of advice and ways to see things for parents to help give them some more clarity. And I honestly hope that a lot of doctors will listen to this too, because it's a challenge for doctors as well to figure out, are we dealing with inflammation? Are we dealing with behavior? Where do we come into that line? So I'm hopeful that this will be helpful for doctors as well. But yeah, I think it was just really useful information, and I'm so grateful that you were willing to come in and do the best that we can with the and we always, as you said, when you do better, when you know better, you do better, and you just always have to make continued progress. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. It's always a joy talking with you too.
All right,
guys.
Bye, guys. We hope you found this episode helpful, hopeful, and inspiring. We try to get a new episode out every week. You can make sure you don't miss any by following us on Spotify or subscribing to our channel on YouTube. If you want to connect with us more, join our Facebook group, Homeopathy for PANS and PANDAS, where we have exclusive weekly videos and answer your questions about, you guessed it, homeopathy for PANS and PANDAS throughout the week. If you are already a member, give us a shout out and let us know what you thought about this episode. If you aren't on Facebook and would like to reach us, you can email us at podcast@resiliencenaturopathic.com. Until next time, take care, and remember, this won't be forever.